Why don't apologists ever talk about the ascension? I've been pretty passionately engaged in Christian apologetics for almost 2 decades. Most of that time as a Christian, and only in the last few years as a non-believer. But over the years, I've started to notice something about the industry of Christian apologetics, about what defenders of the faith do and don't talk about. And there's one subject in particular that when I first started to question my faith, I couldn't help noticing they almost never talk about. I'm referring, of course, to the ascension. But before we talk about that, it's worth pointing out how surprising this is theologically, especially considering how much apologists love to talk about the resurrection. I mean, the historical case for the resurrection is pretty obviously one of the evangelical industrial complex's biggest exports, at least when it wants to present itself as an intellectually robust, evidence-based worldview. There's an entire cottage industry of large books covering every detail of the evidence for the claim that Jesus rose from the dead, from the empty tomb to all the specific appearances to individuals and groups, except, strangely, for the last appearance, the one we read about in Acts 1, where Jesus concludes his time on earth by flying up into the clouds like he's Superman. For all the ink that's been spilled and all the talks that have been given on the resurrection, there's a conspicuous silence on the ascension, which is directly and integrally related to the resurrection. I've combed through several books and listened to dozens of talks by Gary Habermas on his minimal facts argument for the resurrection, and maybe I've just missed it, but I have yet to see or hear him talk about the ascension. Mike Licona has written one of the most comprehensive investigations of all the relevant evidence in his 700-page book, The Resurrection of Jesus, and yet the ascension doesn't even appear in the index. William Lane Craig, in his 1989 book, Assessing the Evidence for the Historicity of the Resurrection, has a detailed discussion of all the other appearances of the risen Jesus, and yet this is what he says about the ascension. Quote, Luke does refer to the ascension of Jesus in his gospel, and this might be called a resurrection appearance, but an investigation of the ascension is a study all of its own and would not substantially affect the results of our discussion. Therefore, we will not cross the line to include it in this study. Unquote. That's a really strange omission. Actually, the only resurrection apologist I know of who directly addresses the ascension without visibly squirming is the great British theologian N.T. Wright, in his books The Resurrection of the Son of God and Surprised by Hope. I might make a video in the future all about Wright's view of the ascension if enough people are interested in that, because it's a very interesting and idiosyncratic view. But for this video, I just want to ask the question, why is there such an awkward silence from most apologists on the question of the ascension? Now, I don't think it's because there's some deliberate conspiracy of silence. I don't think it's intentional at all. Honestly, I think it just comes down to good old-fashioned confirmation bias. I think apologists don't talk about the ascension because, as central and important as it is to the gospel theologically, from the perspective of the modern historian and from the perspective of modern cosmology, it's just really, really embarrassing. And it's embarrassing for a few reasons. Looking at the ascension historically, it just doesn't hold up very well. For one thing, it doesn't carry the crucial indices of early or multiple attestation. While there seems to be a clear belief throughout the New Testament that Jesus ascended to heaven in fulfillment of Psalm 110, Luke is actually the only gospel writer, the only writer in the New Testament at all, who gives us an actual account of this event. And that account was written at least half a century after the fact. This suggests, just by itself, that Luke might be historicizing or putting into narrative form something the earliest Christians believed for, well, much less historical reasons. It's also embarrassing to the historian, ironically, because it doesn't pass the criteria of embarrassment. It just looks suspiciously convenient. A lot like the Mormon story about Joseph Smith returning the golden plates to the angel Moroni after translating the Book of Mormon. Luke's narrative of the ascension looks a lot like an ad hoc explanation for why the appearances of the risen Jesus ceased with the apostles. It's easy to see how a story like that could have helped reduce the dissonance caused by Jesus' continued absence after the initial flurry of excitement following Easter. But probably the most embarrassing aspect of the ascension is how obviously mythological it is. Because when we read Luke's narrative without any harmonistic or concordist agenda, it seems like it uncritically reflects the three-tiered universe of ancient Near Eastern cosmology. That is, the view that heaven is literally above our heads and the underworld is literally below our feet. This was the accepted view of the cosmos throughout the ancient Near East, and it's the view of the Old Testament traditions that Luke is drawing on, such as the ascension of Elijah in 2 Kings 2. When Jesus goes to heaven in Acts 1, Luke doesn't picture him just disappearing into another dimension like Narnia, no matter how much N.T. Wright or William Lane Craig wish he had. Rather, we see him ascending up into the clouds, because for Luke, heaven is literally up there, above the circle of the earth. In fact, this was one of the foundational points behind Rudolf Bultmann's whole project of demythologizing the New Testament. As he says in the opening lines of his 1941 manifesto, New Testament and Mythology, quote, "The cosmology of the New Testament is essentially mythical in character. The world is viewed as a three-storied structure with the earth in the center, the heaven above, and the underworld beneath. This, then, is the mythical view of the world that the New Testament presupposes when it presents the event of redemption which is the subject of its preaching." Unquote. You see, Bultmann recognized that the New Testament is so filled with mythology, like this three-story universe that is so foreign to our understanding of reality today, that the modern Christian can't accept it as it comes, but has to demythologize it. And so that's what Bultmann tried to do. But this presents a much bigger problem for more traditional Christians, Christians who want to hold on to the early church's belief that God literally raised Jesus from the dead. Because you can't discard the ascension without calling the resurrection itself into question. In the traditional Christian story, the death, resurrection, ascension, and the second coming of Jesus all fit together in a very clear sequence, each one implying the others. And so you can't take one of them out of the sequence without calling the rest of the sequence into question. And this, I think, is why apologists prefer to simply not talk about it. They're just doing what we all tend to do, counting the hits and ignoring the misses. And by all accounts, the ascension is a pretty big miss.